Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar. I hope everyone's well. It's great to see so many of you joined. I'm just back of 2 weeks leave and straight into a webinar on ESG reporting. I get all the exciting gigs on a Monday morning, but I'm glad that so many of you are interested in this. This is the latest in our series of webinars to support members. We've increased the frequency of these throughout the COVID crisis, but very much moving into some of our more normal policy areas. And I know that many of you have been interested in this, particularly during our finance strategic delivery group meetings over the last few months. We're joined today by colleagues from Centris, the Good Economy and Pension Insurance Corporation. And we're going to be talking about the work that the Good Economy and Centris have been doing together on a white paper on ESG reporting. Clearly, there's been increased interest in environmental, social and governance reporting across the board. But the conversations that we've been having with investors and with others in and around the sector is that this is likely to play a much more fundamental role in the credit process in future. So we think it's really important that we bring housing associations together to discuss this. We know that many of you already have, or all of you in fact, have good existing relationships with lenders, and private investment clearly plays a huge role in ensuring that we can build the affordable homes that Wales needs. Our latest global accounts show that there was over £3 billion of private investment in the sector last year. So I'm not going to talk too much today. It's going to be over to our colleagues. But I think that where this has come from is the work that the Good Economy and Centris have been doing together, which has identified the opportunity for a joined-up approach. So they've been working on a white paper on ESG reporting, which looks at how we can standardise that across the housing association sector. I know at least a couple of you have been involved already in the discussions, but I think it's probably best if I hand over to Phil to set the scene and we can take it from there. Oops, Phil, you're on mute.
There we go. You're on mute seems to be one of the terms of the COVID crisis. Sorry about that. Thanks, Aaron, and good morning to everyone attending this morning. What I thought I would do was just really sort of set the scene on the work that we've been doing, which has been ongoing for some time now, and I think it broadly comes out of the back of some work that we started doing with Peabody when Susan Hickey was still at Peabody as the CFO. She's since left that role, but has carried on working with the group. And Susan and I were in a couple of investor meetings where the question of ESG came up, flagged from the investor side and asking about Peabody's ESG reporting. And the background to this from the investor side, and no doubt Effie will talk about this a little bit later on, is around the sort of increasing pressure that's coming on both banks and institutional investors from a whole range of stakeholders, be that regulators, policymakers, shareholders, or underlying pension fund or insurance clients, where they're putting pressure from a sort of a user perspective and a regulatory perspective onto those people that are responsible for investing and managing money, to make sure that their investments have sort of passed the hygiene test in terms of environmental, social and governance aspects. And so what you're seeing from lenders and investors is a greater focus because of those pressures on ESG reporting that perhaps hasn't existed before. And I suppose when you think about it from the housing sector perspective, social housing should and does, in my view, have a very strong sort of fundamental case to present on all of those factors of the way it does business. And to some extent, I suspect that's led to a slight degree of complacency, I suppose, in how the sector has articulated these underlying credentials. And certainly there's been, I suppose, a lack of conformity or a lack of sort of presentation of that information that's come across. And so what we found was happening on the investor side, certainly with some of our clients that are larger and more frequent issuers in the debt capital markets, was that investors were starting to sort of take matters into their own hands and pushing out questionnaires probably lifted from other areas of their business. So some of our clients were starting to receive 3 or 4 different questionnaires really sort of aimed at the same subject, but not using sort of standardized data or metrics or anything like that. So what we set about when we kicked off this project was really to say, well, look, as a sector that is used to working together and collaborating on issues such as this, wouldn't it make sense if, rather than reacting to different requests from lenders and investors on ESG, that we try to set about creating a standardized reporting framework for housing associations to be able to say, well, look, this is the data that we produce anyway, this is the way we report on stuff, and these are the issues that we think are relevant for each of those sort of E, S and G brackets. And so what we did was set about sort of forming a kind of coalition of the willing, drawn from housing association side of the market, the investor side of the market, lenders, professional advisors, and other interested stakeholders, to really sort of sit down and try and sketch out what that should look like. So that came out in the draft paper that was issued earlier this year. Obviously, we're in a consultation phase at the moment and looking then in mid-October to publish the final set of recommendations from that. Before I hand over to fellow speakers, I think there's just a couple of, if you like, questions that we frequently have been hit with around what are the benefits to this, because I think quite often people approach this from a perspective and say, well, what's in it for me type thing, which is a not unreasonable question to ask if you're being asked to sort of embed additional reporting into your ongoing processes. A question we get quite a lot is, will it make my funding cheaper? And my usual response to that is to say, well, possibly, but not necessarily. But if you don't do it, it's going to make funding more difficult for you going forward. And I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which this, I think, is going to become a more fundamental part of the credit process for lenders and investors when they're looking at lending to you, and having good basic levels of sort of hygiene around ESG reporting, if you like, sort of ensures that you get a tick against your name on that, rather than sort of facing another set of questions. So I think I view it as just that, really, a sort of good basic hygiene test of your lender and investor relations going forward. It does, I think, provide a common starting point for everyone to hopefully try and get to, in order to then look at taking it on to a next level of areas like impact investing, for example, where you might take in lower cost funds which are aimed at specific projects or outcomes that have a very clear social or environmental objective, and in order to sort of get to that stage of looking at some of those types of schemes, I think having a good basic framework for ESG reporting really sort of provides the foundations for moving on to look at some of those other things, which might indeed unlock different sources of capital or investors, or possibly indeed cheaper funding. So that's really a little bit of scene setting. I know colleagues are going to sort of go into a little bit more detail about the framework itself and where the process is going from here, and also sort of how you guys can get involved and support the process in getting on to the next stage. So that was really all I wanted to say, Aaron, at this stage. So I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Phil. It's a really helpful overview. So we see ESG reporting as a basic hygiene test of investment, a hand sanitizer, if you will, of your finance work. Really important, I think you talked through there the investors view, and I'm really pleased we can be joined this morning by Effie from the Pension Insurance Corporation, and Effie's going to give us a quick run through of the investors view of this work and how this can support our work with investors. So I'll hand over to you, Effie. Effie, you're on mute, sorry.
Good morning, everyone. I am representing Pension Insurance Corporation today at the panel. You probably know us already, just to highlight that the purpose of Pension Insurance Corporation is to pay the pensions of our current and future policyholders, and remaining true to that purpose, it is very important to manage risks, including ESG risks. I'm part of credit research. We are responsible for analyzing credit risks for our investments, and we also see an increasing need from the UK public to see their pension investments have a positive impact. So for us, it's quite important to look at ESG risks. Our approach is to integrate ESG and climate change in our investment process. So we are very, very focused on ESG risks, and it's at a very senior level. We are now a signatory of the UNPRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. That's since December 2019, and we are in the process of implementing these principles. Now, PIC is an important large investor in the housing association sector. We have invested in English, Welsh, Scottish housing associations for a bit more than a bit less than a decade, and we are very, very supportive of this initiative. I guess that we all know that housing associations, they have a social purpose, they have a positive impact to communities. It is self-evident, if you like, that they do the right thing from an ESG viewpoint. But there is, as mentioned earlier, an increasing need to report these credentials. So for that reason, we are very supportive of this initiative. We are one of the investors who are sending out ESG questionnaires to our borrowers as part of our ESG risk assessment. So having an industry-wide standard would help us in getting the information we need to make an informed decision about any material ESG risks. It also helps the housing association, who we feel knowing what to strive for from an ESG perspective and how to best report the different aspects that we are looking for. And yeah.
Great, thank you, Effie. It's really great to hear from the investor on their view. I think from our perspective, when we've been thinking about where this sits in our work, this feels like something that sits quite nicely alongside lots of the work we're doing around demonstrating impact, with a particular focus on the finance audience. So it's great to hear about what some of the benefits might be. And last but not least, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Forster from The Good Economy. Sarah, you've been working on this project, and you're going to give a bit of an overview of the criteria and how housing associations can feed into that and how people can get involved.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And I've learned now to, anyway, I've managed to be on live. So yes, I just wanted to tell you a few words about us, who we are, The Good Economy, and then walk you through really the approach we've taken with developing this ESG standard and where it's at and what the sort of activities are that are coming up. So The Good Economy, we are a specialist advisory firm that was set up about 5 years ago. And we really focus on helping organizations sort of integrate impact considerations into investment and business decision making, with a bigger mission of really how can we sort of influence flows of capital to deliver a more inclusive and sustainable development. And for us, really, good housing is a fundamental part of a good economy. I mean, it's been very clear to all of us in lockdown that having a good quality, affordable home is really, the bedrock of quality of life. So affordable housing is a key theme for us, as are good jobs. So our work has been primarily our advisory services with sort of private investors in housing and how they deliver on impact. But when Phil, as he explained with Peabody, saw the need and opportunity really to develop a standardized approach to ESG and impact reporting, they reached out to us and said, would we be willing to help sort of lead and facilitate the process? And we said, absolutely. So we've led this project really as a collaborative public benefit project with the support of the working group. There's a dedicated website, which hopefully you've seen, called ESG Social Housing, where you can see who's been involved. So I just want to walk you through a little bit, the approach and principles. So as Phil and Effie have said, this initiative came out really from a sort of a market demand for a more consistent, transparent and comparable reporting against ESG factors. And what we were keen to ensure is that reporting approach that's been developed was a meaningful one. This was not to become a tick box exercise, but really that we were looking at ESG factors that influence the quality of homes, the affordability, the extent to which we're kind of meeting net zero carbon targets. So it's been developed in a very collaborative way. We founded the approach on 3 principles. One was that we would always use metrics where they already existed. So already the sector is, reports a lot of the information that's required. So we've looked to align with existing metrics. So for example, in governance, we know the National Housing Federation, who we've liaised with very closely, are bringing out a new code of governance. So we'll absolutely make sure that the final version of the standard sort of is aligned with that, for example. We also look to align with international standards. So, the Climate Finance Initiative, GRI standards, wherever there's an existing metric that's relevant, we've used that and not created a new one. The second principle is that we wanted this approach to be useful and usable by all sizes of housing association, including small and medium. And I'm hoping today, some of you listening there may come from small and medium-sized organisations, and we would love to hear from you. But what we absolutely wanted to avoid is that somehow this was an approach that was easier for the large housing associations to report against, and there could be an unintended consequence that sort of capital would favour the large. And we absolutely didn't want that to be the case. We're very aware that small and medium-sized housing associations play a really important role in their local communities. So that was important to us. And thirdly, we had a principle that we wanted to really focus on questions that were sort of relevant, meaningful and possible to answer. So that's sort of been, underlying the approach. So where are we now? Well, in May, hopefully most of you have seen the white paper that was published with the first version of this sort of ESG approach. So that had 10 themes and 45 criteria. The largest number of themes are in the sort of social area, which I think instinctively is where a lot of people would say housing associations make a positive contribution, and those were around metrics related to affordability. So are these homes genuinely affordable, particularly to those on low incomes? Building safety, clearly a very, very hot topic. Resident voice is also there, and placemaking. The role of housing associations, not just providing quality homes, but also supporting their residents and local places deliver sort of in a positive way. Then the environmental themes are mainly around climate change and sort of ecology, resource management, and then the governance themes are really around the sort of the quality of the board, risk management, and sort of quality of governance that really, in my mind, underpins the delivery of social environmental performance. And across, I'd say investors, housing associations, governance, and culture actually are key to taking these issues seriously. So we published in May. We then put the paper out to consultation. We had a really good response. So we had about 50 people actually write in with very detailed responses to the criteria, some of it very technical. And then we held a series of webinars such that I think all in all about 400 organisations and individuals have been involved in the feedback period, and that is from all sizes of housing associations. We had a dedicated webinar with TPAS so that we could speak directly to residents about the relevance of this to them, and also lenders, investors of all shapes and sizes. Also developers have been in touch, and architects around issues of good design. So we've had very widespread engagement. We are now we've essentially taken that feedback and analysed it, and we're in the process of reviewing the criteria, and we will be publishing, as Phil mentioned, in October, a new version of the white paper with a new set of ESG, revised, updated sort of ESG reporting approach, which we'll be putting out. I'm really wanting to have that as a sort of voluntary reporting standard within the industry that is sort of tested and adopted by housing organisations and investors and lenders. So on that, we've put out a call for organisations to become early adopters. And it'd be great if any of you, after listening to this, hopefully, feel that that's something you'd like to be part of. What that means for housing associations is essentially that you are committing to reporting on this information. We recognise that different organisations may find it easier to report on some metrics than others. We all have to start somewhere, so it will be a bit of a journey, but we'll work with the early adopters to look at what sort of that reporting looks like. And then the same on the investor and lender side. The idea is that investors would start to appraise or use these criteria in their credit assessment or investment decision-making process. So that's there's a call out there to be early adopters and also endorsers. If you're not in those two categories, we also very much welcome other organisations to endorse the standard. So organisations like the National Housing Federation, we would hope that your Welsh housing body will become endorsers of the standard. And then beyond that, two more points before I sort of close, and we, as we say, we very much welcome your feedback and questions. One is we would like to move this approach into something that sits within a sort of governance arrangement. So we're in the process of looking at what an appropriate governance arrangement would look like. We're modelling our ideas a little bit like the SORP governance body. So I think those of you in the housing sector are probably aware that under the Financial Reporting Council, there are financial accounting guidelines and a body that oversees the sort of interpretation and implementation of those guidelines. And we see this effectively sitting as as non-financial reporting, sort of sustainability standards, if you like. So we're looking to set up a governance body with a chair and very much practitioner-led board to oversee the further development of the standard, and then the early adopters group will become a working group that are actually testing out and putting it to use in practice. So that's those governance arrangements are currently in development. And then the other thing that's also happening is on the back of this ESG work, we established a group of investors and housing association to look specifically at impact reporting. So how do we go beyond ESG reporting towards defining impact objectives and then measuring and reporting on impact. So that working group is up and running. On the register provider side, that's actually been led and facilitated by Hyde Housing, who've done work on social value of a tenancy, which is is relevant, and they're bringing to the table. So that if anyone's interested in that group, we can tell you more. So yes, time-wise, we're looking to launch the final version in October and to have early adopters sort of sign up over the next couple of weeks. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn back to Aaron, but I do hope you have questions and we're happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. It's a really helpful run through. I think so. Just before we move to questions, from our perspective, we've been in a couple of discussions with Centris and the good economy, and there's been lots of really good work done, particularly with the NatFed. We're keen now to look at how this works in devolved context and get feedback from our members. So we're planning to have a discussion with members through the Finance SDG, as well as some of our other strategic delivery groups over the next few weeks to see how this works and how people can get involved. There's an opportunity now for questions to Sarah, Effie, or Phil. I think Andy's on the line as well, who's worked on this, Sarah, for any additional questions. Please feel free to pop them in the chat box on the right-hand side, and I will present them to the relevant people. Is there anything else any of the panelists would like to add before we get any questions in? No.
I mean, I suppose one question I have to the audience, if you like, is, you know, we mentioned this point about we wanted this to be, you know, usable by all sides of housing associations. So, you know, if there are representatives out there, you know, it'd be good to hear, you know, what they think actually.
Sarah, I suppose it's Phil here. I suppose it's also worth just clarifying what we're looking for from different organisations as well, because I think we've identified that there are obviously users or people who can employ the framework going forward as an adopter, i.e. the housing association or the lender or the investor. But there are also sort of other participants in the market, be they advisors or lawyers or property firms or trade bodies, Aaron, who we're looking for to effectively sort of endorse the recommendations of the report as well. So in terms of sort of early adopters, there's also that sort of endorser category sitting off to the side as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Phil. I've got the first question in from Reese at ADRA. Is the final version likely to be similar to the draft 10 themes and 45 criteria?
Similar, but in some cases different. So that we are looking at sort of changing some of the themes and also sort of honing down some of the criteria. So there's been a lot of feedback, particularly on some of the environmental criteria and governance criteria that we're taking into account. So that will mean that there'll be some shifting around in terms of numbers of themes and criteria, certainly. You know, one of the areas as well that's come up is whether these criteria should be taken into supply chains as well as housing associations. So that is a topic we will be discussing in the white paper. And then the other question that's come up is in the first version we had sort of core and secondary criteria, and some people felt that the secondary was seen as not important, and actually there were some important issues in that. So I think now we've got core reporting and enhanced, but the idea is that the reporting approach is such that you can sort of, there is quite a, you can actually report where you're at. So on environmental strategy, you can report your objectives and then your progress over the years. So I would say it's going to be refined, and there will be some changes essentially. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, something else going on there? No, great. I've got two further questions. So Nathan from Newport City Homes, I think you've touched on this a little bit in that answer there, Sarah, but I was asked if you're able to share some feedback or the high-level themes that you've received in response to that original white paper. Perhaps beyond that, you said perhaps it might be a bit early in the process, but I think you've covered some of that there.
Yes, I mean, I'm actually wondering, I mean, Andy, do you want to, we're allowed to have another voice, aren't we, at the table? I mean, Andy's the one who's been really analysing the feedback. Andy, I just wondered if you want to kind of give people a little bit of a flavour of what's come in.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy. I work with Sarah at The Good Economy. I mean, yeah, as Sarah hinted at earlier, we had a large amount of feedback from a whole range of people. There are a couple of recurring themes, though, I suppose, that we did hear. One was sort of a question around thresholds and the kind of this question of are we trying to set sort of a standard here? Are we trying to say what level is good? And I think that question was asked in a number of different ways. And I think our response to that is that really what we're trying to do is define a way of reporting And so we were trying to set like a really broad set of criteria which everybody can report against, but not necessarily set limits and thresholds. And actually, we think it's for other people to set what they think is good enough, because actually that would just vary a lot on context and situation. And so that's not the aim of this. This is just a consistent way of reporting rather than a sort of a set way of measuring what excellent looks like. Another piece of feedback a recurring piece of feedback we heard was just around the need for a bit more clarity and sort of tightening up a few different criteria. And so that's a number of the changes we've made are striving to make the criteria more easy to compare, but also just a bit less ambiguous. So that's one of the real kind of themes of the changes that we're suggesting at the moment.
Great, thank you, Andy. Anything to add, Sarah, before we move on to the next question?
No, let's move on.
Okay, we've got a question from James from Pobble. Phil, you mentioned that ESG reporting is mainly being seen as a hygiene factor by funders rather than a way to save money. However, there's some reports of funders keen to promote green loans with indications of perhaps up to 6 basis point savings to interest rates where ESG targets are defined. Is that common?
There have been a number of bank loans in particular written on that basis, James, with sort of marginal improvements in funding costs based on defined targets. So interestingly, I would probably sort of put that into the impact bucket as opposed to necessarily the ESG reporting bucket, because the targets that are set on that are defined around a whole range of outcomes or deliverables, be they number of childcare places made available, or people in employment, or whatever it is. There's a whole range of different ones. So that really sort of tells you more about impact lending, where a lender says, well, I'm going to lend you this pound of money and I want to see that pound of money linked specifically, either spent specifically on this activity or linked in funding cost terms to a particular outcome that you've committed to delivering. And so I think, as I was saying earlier, it's ESG I see as kind of getting everyone up to a good standard of housekeeping and hygiene on the reporting side, and that then provides a good basis onto which you can look at some of these impact related loans, which are becoming more popular. There's more and more capital flowing into that part of the market. So I think we'd expect to see a bit more of that.
Thank you, Phil. There's a couple of questions on early adoption. Just to say, we will share the contact details of all of the panel after this session for further questions. But Sarah, will those who are early adopters need to report by a specific deadline?
Okay, so on early adopters, what we're seeking to do right now is to get people to register interest in being an early adopter, and then we're going to talk to the early adopters group. Well, so the early adopters group will get to see the revised criteria before they go public. So in September, we'll share the revised criteria with the early adopters group, which is sort of housing associations and investors. And then the plan is to have a joint meeting to decide what it means in practice to be an early adopter, including, when, the reporting standard. What I think essentially we think is it should be, on the housing association side, a commitment to report in your next financial accounts or your next financial accounting period against the ESG standard, information requirement. But the thinking is that probably, and this is for discussion with everyone, but that probably it would be done in a separate sort of sustainability report. But some of it will sit within your financial accounts. There is an issue here, and we'll be doing this with the accountancy firms, of factors which are seen as material and will be in your financial accounts, and those which are material more to sort of stakeholders and maybe sit better in a separate sustainability report. So I suppose it's a long answer, but I think the point is we want our early adopters to engage with us on what reporting actually looks like in practice. So if you're interested in being an early adopter, do sign up. You don't need to make a decision until these discussions have been had. So at this point, it's a question of signing up to express your interest. And then in October, when we publish then we'll be saying, this is what early adopters are doing from a reporting perspective. But I think I think the next financial year is next year, so that what we're thinking is there's time then to be able to report publicly, for next year. Optivo, if people want to have a look, have already published something, so that is worth a look. Some of our working group members are a little bit ahead of the game and already beginning to try and use the reporting framework.
Perhaps when we share the details on early adoption and some of those contact details, we can share that Optivo report as well, just as an example of what is being done. Unless there are any last minute additions, I think that's all of the questions. So I think that all that remains is to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists. It's been really helpful run through, and hopefully we will get lots of interest, lots of further questions. I know that we're planning to discuss this at our own finance group later in the week to sort of to get some reflections on this webinar and see how we can take this further and how it fits with the rest of our policy work, particularly around demonstrating impact to various audiences. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for your questions. As I say, we will follow up with further information in the next couple of days. But if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop me a line or to contact any of the panelists. We will share their contact details. And thank you very much for attending. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.